So it's great to have all of you here in person, those of you Facebook Live, watching by our YouTube channel. I'm so glad you're here. I'm excited. I know I always get excited when we start a new series. And this series is called Balanced. It's about money. And I know that can be a tricky subject. So I thought I'm going to start off, since the series is called Balance, I'm going to talk about balance. And I want to share 3 laws of balance. So if you have your message notes, that's already the first one. We're talking about 3 laws of balance. And when you want to balance something, there are 3 major important laws that you have to follow to keep things balanced. So the first one is a reference point. As I'm balancing this stick, my reference point is the top of it. If I keep my eyes there, I do pretty well. Now if I decide if I change my focus, I'm going to talk to all of you, I can't do it. Because I need to know where the top of this stick is in order to keep it vertical, right? So that's the rule number 1. You have to have a reference point. And I don't know if you ever watched competitive cheerleading. My niece was into this for years, and they would do these things where they would stack up like 3 or 4 people high, and she was kind of petite, so she was always the person at the top of the stack. And I was always amazed at what they could do. And they teach you for balance, especially in cheering, you gotta have a reference point. And for them, they say, like, pick a spot way out there, a fixed spot in the distance, and keep your focus on that. That'll help keep you balanced. And so this works not only for the stick, but as we're going to learn throughout the series, having a good reference point will help us with our finances. That's the first rule, the first law. The second law is constant correction, right? I mean, you notice I have to continually move my hand. If I just decide I'm going to stop, whoop, there it goes, right? So if I don't have constant, continual correction, and the reference point thing too, I looked at the screen. So if I stop correcting, it falls down. You've experienced this, like if you ever gone for like a hike in the woods, like when I grew up, I lived kind of on the edge of a rugged place. We would go down this lane, and we could go into the woods and stuff, and sometimes there were creeks to cross, and it was always great. Like I love as a kid crossing a creek. When you're looking for like either a plank someone's put out, or if even better, a log, right, that you can cross on. When you cross on the log, right, you have to constantly correct, right? You keep going, so like you'll do kind of like one of these things, like you're correcting your balance as you go. If you don't correct, you can't stay balanced. And the reality is with finances, it's the same way. When you stop the correcting and adjusting, you get out of balance, right? And we're going to be talking about why it's so important to be balanced in our finances. So the first one, you get a reference point, constant correction. And then the third law of balance is you have to have a clear objective, right? So what's my objective here is I want to keep this stick vertical, right? And if I forget that, I think, hey, I'm going to get a drink of water. Like, I lost my focus, my objective, and it doesn't happen. So it's really important to keep that. Remember why we're doing it, right? What's my objective? When you're hiking through the woods and you come to a creek and you want to cross, your objective is you want to get where you're going, right? You want to. So we're going to talk about how all these things relate to finances. Because it's really important. If you don't keep the focus on what your reference point is, the stick falls. If you don't constantly correct, if you get distracted with other things, the stick falls. Now, what's interesting is, in the area of personal finances, do you know what happens If you violate these laws of balance in your personal finance, you know what the immediate consequence is? Nothing. Okay? That's why so many of us have had times of our lives when our personal finances are out of whack, right? Because finances aren't like the pole. With the pole, if I don't continually follow these laws, it falls down. The consequences are immediate, right away. Now, if finances were like, you know, I say, if every time you lied, like Pinocchio, your nose grew, right? You would stop lying, right? Because you wouldn't want that to happen. And finances don't work on the law of Pinocchio. They work more like on the law of harvest, right? So that's the next point, is that finances follow the law of harvest, not the law of Pinocchio. So finances are more what oftentimes in the Bible it's called sowing and reaping, right? You know, planting and harvesting. That's how finances work. So let's say you have two farmers, and one goes out and he spends all day, and he just plants seeds in his field. He just plants seeds all day long. And you have a second farmer who decides, I'm going to sleep in, maybe watch a little TV, and I'm going to take a nap in the afternoon. He doesn't plant anything. And in 1 week's time, the farmers go out, and you know what they have? Exactly the same thing, right? Because planting and harvesting, there's a lag, there's a delay. But there's also another really great principle of harvesting that isn't, you know, it may not be immediate, you may wait for the harvest, but so it's what I'm calling later and greater. So the harvest comes later, but it also is greater. You plant a few seeds and you get a ton of results when you plant. And so if finances worked like the pole that I was balancing, we'd all be in great shape financially, right? As soon as you did something and you got immediate results, you're like, well, I got to stop doing that. But the laws of finance work a whole lot more like harvest. So one person can be doing great things financially and be in balance, and another one can be doing terrible things and be out of balance, and a week or two later, it pretty much looks the same. And so it's very easy for us to get out of balance. But the laws of harvest are very direct. God makes it very clear. In Galatians 6:7, the verses I'm sharing today are ones you've all heard before. He says, don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. So whatever you plant, that is going to be what you're going to get. And so in your personal finances, whatever you plant, that's what you're going to harvest. And if you plant well, not only will it come later, but it will be greater, because that's how it works. Now, one other thing I should mention, I think it's rather obvious, but I think it's worth stating, is that when it comes to financial principles and the financial laws, they don't follow the law of fairness, right? Finances are not fair. Generally, people who are rich continue to be rich or get richer, and those who are poorer tend to always struggle. I mean, that's just the way it is, you know. So if you know people who have a decent amount of money, they're pretty well off. Odds are very likely that they're going to always have money, and their offspring are going to have money, and that's just how it works. It's not fair. You know, if it was fair, we would all have the same kind of nice car. We'd all live in the same kind of nice house, but it doesn't work that way. But the great news is, I got to tell you, you're richer than you think you are. I did a series a couple years ago called Rich, and I tried to convince everyone that they were rich, because basically, just the simple fact that we're Americans puts us in the top half. Like we're the top 50%, right, already. Even if you're the poorest American, you're the top 50% in the world. And so the good news is it may not seem like it, but we have some financial resources, and that's why it's so important that we have them balanced, and that we follow the principles of the Bible. Now, some of you may be wondering, you know, why are you talking about finances in church, right? It just makes me uncomfortable, and of course, usually, in my past, the reason finances were talked about in church is the preacher was telling you guys got to give more. Let's give more, right? You know, and I want you to know there's no big gotcha coming at the end, and it's not going to end of the series and be like, and now we have this big giving campaign, and you got to give. I'm not going there, okay? I'm doing this because The Bible talks a lot about money. Jesus taught about money more than he taught about heaven, hell, and prayer combined. And the reality is that when the Bible teaches about money, it's a little bit about giving, but more of it is about being financially balanced. And so I'm doing this for all of us to help. I'm not doing this so that you'll give more money. That'd be fine if you did, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because finances and how we handle them and when we're out of balance, it can have such deep consequences. And so the reality is when finances are out of balance, we do have problems. That's point number 3. Being out of balance financially creates problems. And I think we all know that. Now, sometimes when we're out of balance financially, the problems are financial. But oftentimes they show up in other places. But there's always some kind of consequence. The easiest to see are the Pinocchio type problems, right? You write a check, you don't have enough money in the bank, it bounces, bam, that's pretty much Pinocchio. You find out pretty quickly you're overdrawn, right? But there are a lot of financial things that we do that are more on the harvest plan, where you can be out of balance, you can not do things well, and you can't really tell you have a problem for quite a while. And oftentimes financial problems show up in other areas, primarily relationships or in marriages. The statistic used to be, I think, that the number one cause of divorce was financial stuff, right? And I would describe it in this context as the finances in that marriage were out of balance, and it created conflict in the relationship to the point where they just couldn't stay together. And that happens a lot. And so, think about it. If you grew up in a household where your parents argued about money, or maybe you have an older sibling and you've seen them and their spouse, they argue about money virtually all the time, right? The reality, though, is, and some of you may not want to hear this, but the reality is it's usually not a problem that there's not enough money. There's usually enough money. It's that the money management is out of balance. But fighting that they have is because of how the money is managed. Maybe they're totally at odds about how they view debt. Maybe they're totally at odds about how they save or the priorities of spending. And this creates conflict and trouble. But yeah, so I'd say most cases in relationships where you've got combined finances in marriage and families, the problems and the arguing come because things are out of balance. And I would say they don't really have a financial problem, they have a marriage imbalance. That's kind of a long way of saying that being out of balance financially leads to all sorts of problems that may not necessarily look like money problems. And so, being out of balance, I said financially creates problems. The next point is not necessarily financial problems. You may not even realize that it's a problem of finances or being out of balance. Most of us learned about finances watching our parents. So they may or may not have taught us, but we watched them and we saw, right? And so if the family you grew up in, your parents, they used credit irresponsibly, it's probably going to be very easy for you to abuse credit. Now, it may not have been a problem for your parents. They may have abused credit but had enough money, but you might be at a point where, if I live like that, now I don't make enough, I'm in trouble. Now it's a problem for me. If kids grow up in a home where they never hear mom and dad talk about how their faith in God, their biblical values intersect with money management, right? It's likely that you have an unbalanced view of finances. And if kids grow up in a home where they never hear parents discussing, well, should we get this or buy this, or should we support this, right? Should we, give to this worthy cause or something that's really touched our heart, or should we get for ourselves? We've never heard them talk about that this is a choice, right? It could mean that you're out of balance financially. Because the reality is that money problems become relationship, marriage, family, life problems. And oftentimes we don't even know where it came from. So, and again, sometimes the problems show themselves in the financial realms, and sometimes other areas, and sometimes both. And so I kind of want to appeal to those of you. I've talked a lot about how it works in relationships and marriage. So if you're single or if you're young and you're thinking, I probably don't have to worry about this yet. I'm telling you, this is the perfect time to get in balance financially. You might be thinking, well, I don't, or you might be thinking, I don't have a lot of money anyway, so it doesn't matter. Well, that's when it matters the most, right? Establishing life patterns, following the principles. And we're going to be talking over this series about what the biblical principles of balance and finance are all about. And so, you might already be feeling tension in your life. You might be thinking, I'm really touched by, wanting to, the kids in Africa are wanting to sponsor a child. Or like when the missionaries come in 2 weeks and you're just like, man, I want to support them. But then you're thinking, but I can't really afford to, right? And that's often a thing where we're saying, well, there's this great thing you can do and support financially. And you're like, well, I struggle. I don't think I can afford to do it, And so there already is this tension between following your heart and being generous versus the tension of how much money I have. So oftentimes when people get together, it's sort of like this. You have two people that come together. We'll say George and Cindy. So George and Cindy are probably, let's say they're out of balance level 1 in their finances. And then they come together, they get married, and you would think, well, now they'll be level 2 out of balance, right? 1 plus 1 is 2. The reality is they're probably going to be more like level 6 because one's out of balance in one area and one's out of balance in another area, and trying to get that all together can really, they feed off each other's imbalance. And so oftentimes we think, well, when I'm going to go to I'm going to get a new job, a better job, I'll make more money and everything will be better. It's sort of like the principle, a couple that having marital problems, I'm like, well, we'll have kids, then it'll get better. What they have is, now they have the same problems and more responsibility because now they got a kid, right? So I think sometimes we think, well, if I just get that better job or I find some way to change my financial picture, oftentimes we go to the next stage in life with the same issues, the same things. So, it's one thing to be out of balance financially when you have a job. It's another thing to be out of balance financially and then you lose your job, right? Some examples, like you might be a money hoarder. We call them savers, right? One of the problems with people who are extreme savers or hoarders of money is they often find it difficult to be generous. So to me, like that's the antidote. If you're really into or accumulating and we're being financially responsible, make sure you're generous along the way. You might be out of balance because maybe you presume on the future. Well, I'm going to be getting that bonus at Christmas, so let's go ahead and buy the thing we want. Or I'm pretty sure I'm getting a promotion or something new next year. My income's going to be coming up, so we can spend. So you're sort of presuming on the future, which it might be. But if you live your life like that, eventually you're probably going to be disappointed, and because none of us knows what the future holds. So we can express being out of balance in so many varied ways, based on our upbringing, based on our personalities, and so being out of balance financially looks different for every one of us. And of course, we're very easy. It's very easy for us to spot other people's out of balance, right? Oh, because I don't do that. I do my own thing. So. I want one other thing before I kind of get back on track here. I think sometimes we think the solution to our financial imbalance is we just need more money. The reality is, it's the more money you have, the easier it is to be out of balance. Because what happens when you have more money? Well, that's extra. And so when you have extra, you're less disciplined with it, and then you can start habits. So, but the main reason I'm talking about money and doing this balance series is because financial problems come out in all sorts of areas, and the one big one, the next point, is that financial imbalance is an indication of spiritual imbalance, right? So, and I believe this is why the Bible and Jesus in particular talk so much about money. There's some kind of connection between how we manage and how we view and how we use or collect money in our hearts and our spiritual side of it. And so those are the things I'm going to be looking at in this series. And another famous teaching by Jesus, and this is one sentence, and this is so powerful. It says, "Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. And I think we can see that, I sort of get that, but it's so profound. Jesus is telling us that our hearts follow our treasure. The stuff that's really valuable to us, that's where our heart goes. So whatever you value most, whatever's really important to you, that's where your heart goes. And so we might think, if you want to know where someone's heart is, well, listen to how they pray and what they pray for, or look at all the cool quotes they put on social media. Those things are all great, but I say, if you want to know where someone's heart is, where their treasure is, look at their bank statement, look at their credit card statement, look where their spending is, right? Where you spend your money, that's what's important to you. And that will reveal what your treasure is. You may have experienced this on kind of a personal level where you've been in a relationship, maybe you've got a good friend or someone in your family, and you almost felt like you're competing with their stuff. Like maybe for them it's a car or something. And you don't touch the car, you wipe your feet before you get in it, you don't eat food in it, right? It's this big, it's really big to them, and you're thinking to yourself, well, that's their treasure, that's something they value, so their heart's going to it. It might be, it can be different things for different people, I think that this is something to consider. I heard somebody say that don't buy anything that you're afraid to lend out. Like if you've got this prized possession and no one can use it, no one can touch it, like a great cure for that, lend it out, right? You imagine those people lending out their cars? That would be great, wouldn't it? And they're just like, you know what? There you go. Because the reality is if it's that important to you, it qualifies as treasure, and that shows where your heart's leaning. And so this is why the Bible talks so much about possessions, stuff, wealth, money, and this is why I'm doing this series. And here's another thing Jesus said. I'm sure you've heard this too, Luke 16:13. He says, no one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. We can track with that. And then he says, you cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. That's a new word. Oftentimes says you can't serve God and money. And I'm sure you've heard this. And you might be thinking, I wonder, it almost seems like Jesus got that wrong. Shouldn't it be God versus the devil or something more like, why is it God and money? And the reason is it's God and money is because of what stuff can do to us, what it can do to our hearts. Because our hearts follow the stuff we value really importantly, really the most, our treasure. And one thing I've learned in life, our stuff, our possessions, are constantly trying to steal our heart from God. That's why it's so important we be balanced. And so this has been kind of an introductory message today. I'm really looking forward to getting into more detail, sharing some great biblical principles on balance. And so I want to, I'm doing kind of I have one major next step today. It's the challenge. You might have already looked ahead and seen, what is that? That 7-day tracking challenge. What's that thing? And so I want to go back to the first law of balance, the reference point. What are you looking at? What are you focusing on? And to keep balanced. And so for us to serve God and not money, and not be enslaved to money, as the scripture says, I'm challenging you to focus on this week, where's your money going? Right? This isn't even a challenge on change this spending habit, don't do this, don't buy this. It's just take a look at where it's going. And so the major next step today is the 7-day tracking challenge. And this is to check, so from starting right now, for 1 week until next Sunday, keep track of every single cent you spend. Now, maybe some of you are old school, you're just going to get a little paper notebook and write it down, or maybe you're going to do the phone thing, or you've got Quicken or a spreadsheet, but where's your money going? Because if our hearts follow our treasure, then our spending will show us what's really valuable to us. Let's just track it. Again, I'm not even at this point trying to say, change it, adjust it, don't spend as much, don't spend money on this. It's sort of an evaluation, right? What am I focusing on when I'm balancing? What's my reference point? And so we're going to look, where's our money going? Where is it at? And what am I spending? I know this is probably a bigger next step than I usually do. Consider this as like homework, okay? Maybe I should have said that, But where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. So that's the big challenge. And so let's look to the next steps. They're on the back of your message notes, back of the Connect cards. And so the first one is I'm going to accept the 7-day tracking challenge. Record everything I spent for the next week, just to see what am I doing. I didn't realize, man. Look at all the times I went to Starbucks 6 times. I really value a good cup of coffee, or whatever your thing is. Okay, but let's take a look at that. And again, however you want to track that. So that's a huge challenge, but I hope that you will consider doing that. And the second one is kind of more internal. So I consider the possessions that I value the most, my attitudes about finance, and my struggles, commit them to God. Maybe it's just kind of a beginning, like, Lord, I'm going to open myself up to learn more from you. I'm going to take a look, an honest look, how, what the stuff I have, how I spend, what my attitudes are, and say, I'm going to commit that to you, God. You show me what that means for me in my life. Or consider, could I lose these things I love and be okay? Could I give them away? How are they more as important to me as God? I just kind of take a look at those values. And then the last one is commit to attend the rest of the Balance series. Kind of breaking it up and doing a couple weeks, then we're going to do some special services and then some more in August. And again, you can the messages will be online. You can watch if you're not able to be here. But that's the challenge today, kind of the start of Balance. And I'm hoping that this will get us to think about our relationship with money, stuff, and how we manage that. And my goal, my desire for each one of us, that we would be more balanced, or discover areas where we're out of balance so we can fix it. And so I want to pray for you. I know this is a heavy topic, and I just pray the Lord will help us, because I do know that money problems multiply and spread into the rest of our lives. And this is a great practical thing that the Lord wants us to have to manage well. So let me pray for you. Father, we thank you for Jesus, these powerful things that he taught us about treasure in our heart and harvest principle. And in our lives, we want to be balanced. We want to use the money we have well. We don't want it to be a burden or something that gets us in trouble later. And of course, we want our hearts to love you more than any of our possessions. So we pray, help us as we kind of track, we evaluate this week, that you would help us to see more clearly. And as we continue this series, Lord, that you would show us how we can be in tune and in balance with your will in our life. We just pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.